Who is this who comes from Edom in crimson garments from Bozrah? Who is this, glorious in his apparel, striding in the greatness of his strength? It is I who announce vindication, mighty to save. Why is your apparel red, and your garments like one who treads the winepress? The winepress I have trodden alone, and from the peoples no one was with me. I trod them in my anger, and trampled them down in my wrath. Their blood spurted on my garments. All my apparel I stained. For a day of vindication was in my heart. My year for redeeming had come. This poem comes from the first part of the 63rd chapter of Isaiah. The last 10 chapters of Isaiah make up a apocalyptic section. It's a section of visions which focus on the situation after the Israelites had returned from the Babylonian exile. Like a lot of apocalyptic literature, it's told in symbols. And so we have to look at this poem to discern the symbolism inside of it. It's very different from the images of blood we've seen before. It's very different from the first chapter, where we talked about how blood protected the doorposts of the children of Israel in Egypt, or the second one, where we talked about the great covenant in the desert, or the last one, where we talked about how sacrifices and rituals helped heal and helped expiate sins. But this is different. About 100 years ago, there was a Catholic writer who took this image from Isaiah and said that this represented Christ. In some ways this works, but in some ways this doesn't. It really does not work with the suffering servant, which happens earlier in the book of Isaiah. Definitely not with the suffering servant we see during Holy Week. So how do we pick this apart? Well, this passage is a dialogue between a watchman at the gates of Jerusalem and a sole figure that approaches from the east. The watchman challenges the approaching person. At a distance, his garments look crimson. Up close, they look red as well. And so he's saying, "Why have you come?" And the lone figure says, "It is I who bring vindication. It is I who has trampled the winepress. It is I who bring deliverance." To bear in mind, Edom is southeast of Jerusalem. It was the home of a people that were historically hostile to the Jewish people. And in the time period after the Israelites' return, they were raiding Israelite lands because they were being pushed out of their own by the Nabateans. Bozrah is a city in Edom, so this fixes the origin. It's remarkable because this is not an army or even an army of angels that have gone to do this. This is one solitary person, one solitary champion who's done all the work, and he comes back to announce that things are better, that things have come to pass, and that they are now safe. Vindication. Blood in Hebrew scripture, as we've seen so far, can be a positive sign of life, but usually it's portrayed in a negative way. It is a sign of death. It is a sign of ruin. It is something that holds both life and death. So how do we look at this? How do we deal with the idea of wrath and what wrath might mean? There's a lot in the Bible about wrath and blood. But before we probe this too much, I think we need to talk about anger. Hopefully we know what makes us angry, and if you don't, then please find out. Anger is dangerous because anger is destructive. If we fly off the handle, if we just start flailing away out of anger, we can do a lot of damage. Anger can do psychological damage as well as physical damage. Anger can destroy relationships. It can end friendships. So anger, for me, is like atomic energy. Getting exposed to radioactivity hurts everyone. However, what causes anger? Abuse, neglect, lack of opportunity, oppression. All of these fuel anger. Anger is a natural biological response to injustice. Very few people can get to the point where they are impossible to anger, although gosh, wouldn't that be wonderful? But as we look at God's wrath, we have to meditate on anger and the nature of anger. Wrath is another level. Father Schreiter describes wrath as a protest against death dictating how life should be lived. Wrath is more, and wrath cannot overcome injustice in itself. It doesn't have a means to do that. It just builds pressure. The only wrath that's useful is God's wrath, might say. As Father Schreiter says, God's wrath brings about a vindication that our wrath cannot. There's another thing that Father Schreiter said that's very important. Blood keeps before us the memory of the suffering of the innocent, the wronged, and the defenseless. So he puts a key emphasis on memory as a way of coping with wrath. And the memory of injustice works against its repetition. We remember so it doesn't happen again. The most famous example in our lifetimes has been the work of Elie Wiesenthal in keeping alive the horrors of the Holocaust. Some people over the years might have thought he was going overboard with that. Why remember that awful time? Can't we move on? Can't we move away from that? But the trouble is, if we forget times like that, the more opportunity they have to return. The more we forget, the more we fall into the old sins, into the old injustices, into the old traps. Healing from wrath doesn't happen through oblivion, whether it's temporary oblivion or permanent oblivion. Forgive and forget is not in the Bible. We remember so it might not happen again. We remember so that the past will not be relived in the future. We need to take a quick moment to talk about rage. Father Schreiter defines rage as wrath that loses focus and destroys indiscriminately. I think we have seen a lot of this in the past year, particularly in the first month of 2021. Rage happens where people have no hope. People that have no hope are willing to destroy darn near anything, even their own homes, out of rage. Father Schreiter says that when justice is no longer possible, reconciliation is now beyond the pale of possibility. That is the effects of rage. The image of blood in Scripture keeps a channel for vindication open. The symbol of blood is a symbol of our salvation. The Eucharist is an enactment of that. The Eucharist is a representation of that. The chalice is a sign of what God did for Jesus and what God will do for us. As Father Schreiter says, the sign of blood can offer more than a memory of wrath. It is more than an awareness of injustices still to be righted. There is a way through wrath to vindication and reconciliation. Denial does not fix injustice. Continuing injustice feeds wrath. We've seen it in the history of our own country, particularly in race relations. It's been seen all over the world. But the Bible's view of wrath, how wrath is overcome. In Isaiah, it's overcome by the vindicating warrior God in chapter 63. In the New Testament, wrath is overcome by the redemptive suffering of Christ. The image of the winepress that's used here in Isaiah 63 is also used in Revelation 14:18 through 20, the winepress of God's wrath. Father Schreiter says, important as solidarity is, and as crucial as being able to walk with those who suffer continues to be, the passage from Isaiah 63 reveals to us also that there are some injustices that our solidarity cannot overcome. Our struggles for injustice cannot be superseded. Some injustices remain to be dealt with by God alone. This is why God alone treads the winepress. Vindication takes place when God decides, not when we decide. Ancient Israelites would have seen the connection between the winepress to the Jubilee year, the year when all debts were written off, where everything was restored. This is what the image of the winepress suggests as well. Father Schreiter goes on to say, the image of the winepress suggests that there are certain injustices on a almost cosmic level that cannot conceivably be resolved without divine intervention. To know when to struggle and when to wait upon the Lord is the sign of a certain spiritual maturity. Blood is a sign of waiting and hope. One thing that struck me as I've gone through this book again and reflected on my experience with Scripture is that we are never called to be vessels or implements of God's wrath in Scripture. We are called to be Christ's presence in the world. We're called to be people of mercy and reconciliation. We are never called to be instruments of God's wrath. Usually we call people who believe that crazy, rightly so. As we look at life, we want things to be easy. We want things to be understandable, consistent, clear. Spirituality of the blood isn't that. In fact, I dare to say Christianity isn't that. A spirituality of the blood dives into ambiguity, similar to that of the wheat and the weeds growing up together. The revelation to John sees the current time as a time of purification. The symbol of blood keeps us from spiritualizing away pain and suffering. We have to look at what's real as part of our spiritual life. It's not stuck in the clouds. It's down to earth. It's dirty. It's gritty. It's messy. Father Schreiter says what these interpretations do provide is a support for the hope dwelling within us, the hope that helps us stay faithful to a God who promises vindication and justice. In the book of Isaiah, the warrior is God, very clearly. God is not beyond our conflicts, but struggling with us in the very midst of them, Father Schreiter says. Our clothes will be blood-stained as well as followers of Christ. It's something that takes more exploring. It's something that takes more thought, more storytelling. But the blood of wrath and the winepress are signs of memory and of hope. Memory of what happened. Hope that it won't happen again. There's more we can say about this chapter of In Water and in Blood, and will be said soon. Next Tuesday, we're going to release a video here at this very same place where we're going to expand on some of the things I talked about here. I'll be joined by a couple of other folks, one person very familiar to you all, and somebody new to us, new to our spirituality. Very excited about this conversation. And you can join the conversation as well. Please feel free to leave comments in the comments section below, or to contact us if you have something more extensive to say, or if you have an insight that you think we need to be aware of. So in the meantime, may God bless you, may God give you peace, and may we all find redemption in the precious blood of Christ.